Welcome to episode 6, Missionary Service and Mental Illness. So in today's episode, I'm going to discuss some of the difficulties of mental illness within the realms of missionary service, and this means full-time proselyting missionary service. I will speak from my own experiences and those principles I have learned over the years since I served. Now the question's why? Isn't that really the question we all want to ask? Why would the Lord allow someone to return home before finishing their expected 18 to 24 months? Someone who has desired with all their heart to serve the Lord, who has been faithful and true to gospel principles. I certainly don't have every answer because I believe that some of those answers will not be known until after this life. But what I do hope is that by the end of this podcast, you will see the question differently. That you might see why the Lord may have allowed you or someone you know to return honorably and perhaps earlier than expected. So to begin this episode, there are some things I will have to state right up front. This episode is going to be about my own experience and a little bit about my daughter who has clinical depression and who did return home earlier than expected. First, before my mission, I was an undiagnosed, moderate, and sometimes severe rapid cycling bipolar. As I have said before, there were rumblings in the back of my head that something might be wrong and there was something different. And that leads me to my second confession. And that is, up to my mission, I had never really known life without bipolar. So in some ways, I thought that I was quite normal. Third, I rarely talk about any portion of my mission. Not because there were not great moments, but I assume because of the moments that were downright dark and difficult, and mostly even painful. I was never one to really break rules, so that was not an issue, but some of the deep depressions and trauma that came with the disease and the pressures of missionary work left a lasting mark. Some might refer to it as some type of coping mechanism or a PTSD-induced amnesia. I'm not sure of the diagnosis, and at this point I'm not sure that it really matters. I suppose I don't talk about it because of the mental illness. In any case, I have not made contact with anyone from my mission since I left it. Don't get me wrong, I had great companions, still remember many of their names to this day. I remember both of my mission presidents, at least reasonably well. I had wonderful experiences, but the emotional trauma was very real to me, and I believe somewhere deep subconsciously, I didn't and don't desire to relive it. The trauma was not necessarily caused by any exterior forces acting upon me, but rather the effects of the mental illness under the pressures and requirements of a missionary life. Now, there's nothing wrong with the pressures and requirements of missionary life, and they are necessary for missionaries to accomplish the work they need to do. The work is daunting, exacting, exhausting, and very rewarding if done right, and when the body allows it. However, there are portions of the work that do not mix well with mental illness, both bipolar and depression. The rigid schedule is beneficial, but the long hours are not. The constant change of companions and environment, coupled with consistent needs to form relationships with investigators and to talk to strangers, are in direct contrast to the emotional stability needed to treat the disease effectively. So in essence, two of the major factors used most often in treating depression, stability in relationships and consistency in the environmental factors, become compromised simply by the nature of missionary work. I would say that ultimately these two factors, along with some peer social pressure, were the deciding factors in most of the major symptoms and concerns of my mission. Fourth and final, this will really be the first time I talk about my mission and some of my experiences. Not sure if it's that I finally feel whole or that time and distance has been sufficient for me to revisit it. In any case, I hope that it gives you some understanding and light about depression, mental illness, and missionary service. And that in the end, the Lord can still work with the weakest of us. I won't be talking about my service in any type of historical or chronological sequence, as I'm not sure that that would even be effective or helpful. There are some questions that I believe are helpful to be answered, although I am not sure that I have all of the answers for you, I think that I can at least provide some insight as to what those answers might be. So today I'm going to talk about the most pressing of questions that often come to individuals who experience mental illness during their missionary service. It is important to remember that mental illness does not have one single cause, and that the cause of the mental illness is what needs to be treated for long-term recovery. So here are the questions. First, why does the Lord allow individuals to experience mental illness during their missionary service? And what value does that provide to anyone, including companions, members, and investigators? 2, why doesn't the Lord just heal the individual, or at least remove the disease for the length of the missionary service, or diminish it to the point that it doesn't affect the ability of the missionary? 3, can a missionary still effectively serve a mission with a mental illness? Or should we assume that if a potential missionary is afflicted or becomes afflicted with the mental illness, full-time proselyting service is not really an option? And 4th, is it just really insufficient faith in the Lord to heal me? Or is there something else at work? I know that the questions above are perhaps the ones that we have been discussing in the church since mental illness was recognized. I can tell you that I have never really seen or heard anything specifically related to missionary service and mental illness, although I have no doubt there is something out there, and perhaps more than I even realize. So my perspective certainly won't be influenced by anything I have heard or read. I would like to start with some introductory information about my mission and then move more directly into the questions. I served my mission about 28 years ago in central Argentina, the Rosario mission. I had spent a year and a half waiting for my missionary call because I graduated high school when I was 17, simply because I entered elementary school early. The months before the mission were some of the most difficult. Let's just say that the lack of routine or any type of stabilizing force really had made for some challenging days and weeks leading up to my mission. Now, mental illness in the early 90s was relatively new, but not entirely unknown. However, it really wasn't discussed as a concern for a mission. It was more of a hidden disease that people didn't talk about, and it certainly wasn't a factor as it is now in deciding missionary service. Returning home early also had some fairly serious consequences, at least in my head, and I am not sure that I would have survived it. I had a sufficiently fragile self-worth due to the mental illness and the cycling nature of the disease, which caused an inability to develop good relationships. It wasn't that anyone would have said anything to me if I'd returned early, but returning home generally meant that there was a serious issue, and I would have felt the questions even if they didn't exist. Just knowing myself, I would likely have retreated from the church and life and onto some alternate path. Although I guess you can never really tell what would happen. Maybe coming home and obtaining treatment would have turned out far better for me. From what I know about treatment options at the time, I would think that maybe it would have been for the best. But you can't dwell on what might have been, and so I don't. Now, moving on, the MTC provided a needed routine and a break in these cycles I was experiencing just before mission. I did have some minor depression symptoms in the MTC, but again, they were minor. The environment, culture, and the spirit provided sufficient support that I could mask whatever symptoms remained to avoid any questions or concerns from anybody and push most of the other feelings to the side. So I learned Spanish and tried to navigate new relationships and a new routine. The limited time frame, the ample support, similar culture tended to mask the issues of the disease for the most part in the MTC, although that is not true for everyone that does go to the MTC, and that also included one of the elders from my district. He was reassigned stateside due to depression just before we left for Argentina. I suppose looking back that this probably had an effect upon me and my own decisions later on. As far as the disease and symptoms, the same was true for my first assignment to the field inside of Rosario itself. The break of routine and forming a new routine caused the disease to abate for some time. However, I believe that it really simply caused the disease to overcompensate for the added stress, which did intensify the symptoms later. I did begin to see signs of the disease early, about 2 to 3 months into the mission. Depression symptoms can mimic homesickness in many ways, and for me and the mission leadership, this is what initially occurred. With homesickness, time and work is generally the cure. The thought is eventually the body will accept the new reality and then adjust. This is normally quite true for homesickness, but it really doesn't work very well for depression. I will admit one incident that I still clearly remember. Mission presidents have that revelatory power for their missionaries, and I know that my president could see that something was not right about 4 or 5 months into my mission. He specifically asked if I wanted to see a doctor. I believe that it was a psychologist, and it was a family relative, a brother or something of his, although that portion's a little bit hazy. All I remember going through my mind is that my mission assignment would be changed back to the States, or that I would be sent home early, both of which I feared greatly. Not sure if it was the church culture at the time, the negative perspective in which people viewed returning home early, or even someone who was mentally ill, that I didn't have enough faith to make things work, or all three. But due to fear, I declined, and I never spoke about it again with my mission president. Now, my symptoms then began to progress beyond what would be seen as simple homesickness. I became physically ill with headaches, nausea, fatigue, and overall feeling of what could be explained as depression. I did spend a little time with the doctors trying to figure out the issue, but nothing came of it because they were looking for a physical cause. So the conclusion was that it was still homesickness. From this point on out, the disease began its terrible cycles in its normal fashion, and my only relief throughout my mission came from priesthood blessings, which I received somewhat frequently, almost monthly. I would also have to assume that the Lord stepped in many times to help. I can't explain it any other way. I was able to finish the 2 years, able to complete the mission and return home. Here are some of my takeaways from the experience, and then I think we will move right on to the questions. First of all, due to the disease, I was never a stellar or standout missionary, but I wasn't rendered ineffective by it. The Lord worked with what I had to give and provided for the remainder. Now, mission rules weren't exceedingly difficult except for the work hours, which often exhausted my body and exacerbated the symptoms. Now, 3, the pressures of missionary life, relationship building, goal setting and attainment, changing environments and culture, and other more pure missionary pressures to succeed did often cause my disease to intensify in many ways. Something I do believe is that if I had been diagnosed, is that I would have had more tools at my disposal to manage the symptoms more effectively. Although I really don't know whether it would have helped, I assume it would have. But the diagnosis probably would have changed my missionary assignment, and that would have devastated me. I simply didn't understand the nature of the missionary assignment as Elder Bednar has explained it not too recently ago. Now, 4, I did note that while I was teaching lessons, the Spirit would often remove the disease for a time, or perhaps better said, cover the symptoms during the teaching time frames when I was actually teaching the discussions, and maybe for a few hours after. But we did not always teach lessons and found ourselves often tracting, door-to-door knocking, talking to new people, approaching strangers, building relationships seems to cause significant stress. Stress is one of the main treatment concerns in the disease, and it affected me greatly. Boiled down to a few simple ideas, missionary service becomes increasingly difficult based on the nature and development of mental illness. If the illness is undiagnosed or is left untreated, it can and often will render the missionary without the ability to do the work in an effective manner. However, with good treatment and constant vigilance in the mission, I believe that it's very possible for someone to effectively serve and complete the expected time frame. Note now that I said it was possible, and now that's important. Even with diagnosis, treatment, and vigilance, some individuals will still return home. having completed their mission, but not in the expected time frame. Now, having said all that, I would like to address the first question. Why does the Lord allow individuals to experience mental illness during their missionary service? What value does that provide to anyone, including companions, members, investigators, and anyone, in fact? When I see this question, it always leads me to the broader question as to why the Lord would allow anyone to have a mental illness or a severely disabling disease, and what benefits that particular disease would provide for anyone. Now, I'm sure that we have all heard that it gives others a chance to serve. And while that is true, and it is a good reason, it really didn't help me in any way to know that. I mean, wouldn't a mission void of the disease have benefited tremendously and have provided a strong witness that the Lord did love and care for me? I suppose that I could have looked at it and could look at it that way, and I did for a long time. And most of us probably do, but I don't think that the Lord sees it this way. The thought above, when we talk about wouldn't it have benefited me tremendously, is really a limited perspective. The Lord's ways are certainly not ours. He plans for the eternities, not for a moment or a couple years in time. Now, even if that time includes a mission. I've thought and pondered many times why the Lord would have blessed me with such a disease. And you'll notice I say blessed, because now I do look upon it as a blessing. For me, one of the answers from the Book of Mormon, I'm not sure that I particularly liked that this was one of my answers, but this was one of my answers. This is found in Helaman 12:3. And it says, "And thus we see that except the Lord just chasten his people with many afflictions, they will not remember him." What did this mean for me? I needed to be brought to my knees regularly so that the Lord could teach me. Not sure what this exactly says about my nature and pride, but in some ways I suppose that it is true for all of us. We simply are not as diligent when the sun is shining and the birds are singing. We need the rain and the storms. We need trials in our lives to be able to rise to the nature of what our Father in heaven is. I don't believe that we can obtain celestial life without trials and chastisement. The power of the natural man is too often too enticing for us to remember the Lord. And perhaps I needed this more than others. That I don't know. Not that I would say this is true for everyone who has the mental illness disease, for I believe that many have the disease and would still be diligent without it. But I do know that chastisement brings a level of development we can have in no other way. Now, why does the Lord allow for this to occur during missionary service, even to the point that someone returns earlier than the expected time frame? Wouldn't we all be better served having served a full-time proselyting mission? Given my experience with my own daughter, who returned for that exact reason, and knowing of her great desire to serve her entire life, I can say no. I know that the Lord allowed her to return home, and that it was the right thing for her and for her salvation. It seems a little strange to think that returning home would be for her salvation and for her eternal progression. But I know that it was. Returning home before the completed time was more important to her progression than serving the people of Iowa. The Lord was in it. Has it been difficult for her? Absolutely. Has it driven her to her knees? Probably too many times to count. Did she have to go to counseling even after her mission? Yes. But was it right in the Lord's eyes that she should return earlier than expected? Yes, it was. And that was confirmed to everyone involved in the decision. There was no condemnation. There was no sin. She had done what the Lord needed her to do. Will we ever fully know all of the reasons that it contributed to her salvation? Sure we will, but probably not in this life. We need to be content that it was the Lord who made the decision, and she just followed where he led. So my second answer to this first question is that we are unlikely in this life to fully understand all of the why of it. Remember, the Lord sees our eternity and plans for eternity. We only see a small window of time, and even that small window we probably don't see very well. I believe that sometimes the Lord simply cannot explain it to us if he had tried. So he assures us that it was in his plans, and we have to trust that what he does for us is best for us. Now, what value did her experience provide for those involved, including her parents, companions, mission presidents, and others in the church? I actually think there are two great benefits. The first of these is that we need to trust the Lord when it comes to others. The Lord knows what he is doing, and our pleading that he doesn't know what he is doing isn't going to change his mind about what he desires for the salvation of his children. He can and will use every tool at his disposal to accomplish his work, and that includes allowing mental illness to accomplish work, and that includes allowing mental illness to finish someone's mission. We should let him work. Second, judgment is ultimately the Lord's, meaning we should not diminish personal revelation given to others, simply because it does not match some preconceived notion or unwritten church sentiment. There are far too many unwritten, preconceived notions within the church membership, and we would be good to identify them and remove them from our doctrinal perspectives. If those reasons aren't sufficient for you, we can also look to the benefit it provides to others to learn compassion, understanding, empathy, and ultimately charity. Without the sick or afflicted, we would simply have a very difficult time learning these skills. We also must be afflicted to learn. It is a two-way street of instruction. So why does the Lord allow it? Why does he allow individuals to return home early and unexpected? Because it is for the salvation of the individual and those around them. Now, why doesn't the Lord just heal the individual or remove the disease for the length of the missionary service? I will admit that this is probably the underlying question in almost every case of somebody returning home for an illness of any type. I think I could reiterate much of what I just said, but other things can be learned from the illness, such as increased faith, determination, endurance, patience, adaptability, and so much more. I think that we have gotten into the habit of believing that missionary service is the pinnacle of what a young person can accomplish, and nothing can replace long-term service as a missionary. I believe that in some ways, deep down, we think of it or believe it as a rite of passage to celestial life, somewhat like the endowment. If you don't have this full-time enduring service, you are somewhat less qualified to be a leader in the church or for even celestial life. I believe that we believe it to be a commitment to the Lord, an unbreakable bond that we should fulfill under any circumstances. Now, underlying that notion is the idea that anyone unable to serve or who returns due to mental illness is in some ways weak, both in faith and testimony, and had they put their mind to it, they would have accomplished it. I shudder to think what the Lord feels about this type of underlying judgment. The harm we do in thinking this way about any type of calling, especially missionary service, can be devastating to the individual and the calling itself. While we should not choose to break the promise we make to the Lord to serve a full-time mission by sins or other means, the Lord has the right to say when the service is complete at any time without reservation and without comment from those who do not understand the situation or the Lord's will. We cannot see what the Lord sees and what his work is for each of his children, and to say that the Lord would never shorten a call for his purposes is wrong at its very core and denies revelation, the omniscience of God and his love for his children. If the Lord could, I am certain that he would allow for every one of his children to serve a full-time proselyting mission. But he cannot do that and still save all of his children as he desires. So the length of the mission is determined by the Lord, and if sickness isn't healed, then that is the plan, and we must adjust to the Lord's will. End of story. So for those of you who have served and returned early, know that the Lord was in it, and that it was part of your salvation, and perhaps part of others. Now, question number 3, can a missionary still effectively serve a mission with a mental illness? Or should we assume if a potential missionary has had or currently does have a mental illness, full-time proselyting service is not really an option. I believe firmly that a missionary can serve with the illness, and the Lord can temper the disease as much as he tempered the weather in Salt Lake Valley for the pioneers. So my answer is a firm yes. Does this mean that you could go off your medicines, counseling, and other treatments and not concern yourself for the welfare of your body and mind? Absolutely not. The Lord requires us that we do all we can, and then he will provide the rest. So a missionary would have to take special care so that the disease was well managed during missionary service. Would this disease diminish his or her ability to serve? Maybe or maybe not. But isn't it the Lord that states several times in the D&C that the weak things of the earth would thrash the mighty and strong? Weakness comes in many forms, and mental illness is simply one of those. The most important matter is to allow the Lord to choose and then accept his will and decision and go forth rejoicing. Know that you're doing what the Lord wants, whether that is to serve or not to serve, or serve for only a short period of time. Now, is it really insufficient faith in the Lord to heal me if I return home early? Or is there something else at work? I have come to believe that this is another of those unwritten sentiments in the church that's simply false. That if we are not healed, we somehow lack the faith to be healed. Do some people lack faith to be healed? Yes, the Doctrine and Covenants says that there are some. But I believe that a majority of the people under covenant in the church have sufficient faith to be healed. Now, this assumes you're still doing the things you should be, such as prayer and study and other essential daily spiritual tasks. I would doubt that anyone who has been called as a missionary lacks this type of faith to be healed. It has been my experience that the majority of them do not. Now, even given that statement, it is important to remember something else about faith. Elder Bednar once recalled a story about a man who was dying of cancer, and a question had come to his mind that he had never thought about before. And it strikes to the core of the answer about faith to be healed. His question to the man was not about faith to be healed, but that did he have enough faith not to be healed? While this might seem counterintuitive to need faith not to be healed, I believe that the intent of the question was that if the Lord decided not to heal you, would your faith in the Savior decrease? Would you lose the testimony and the witness you have if you were to say, I'm not going to heal you, and that is going to cause you to return home? Or would your testimony remain intact? Could you have sufficient faith to honorably return home before the expected time frame and maintain or even increase your testimony of the Savior and his church? Being healed really doesn't take additional faith or is any type of test to increase your faith. Basically, all the Lord has done is confirmed your current faith in him. And yes, this might build your confidence in the Lord and his existence and mercy. However, if you are able to have sufficient faith not to be healed, you have actually demonstrated a far greater faith and maturity. I believe that the Lord does not heal us to help us learn this type of faith, trust, and maturity. So if you are not healed and return home to continue your life, understand the Lord has deemed you worthy to be tested in more mature and difficult ways. It is not the development of faith to be healed, but the development of the faith not to be healed that provides for exaltation. It is easy to accept the Lord's will when the blessing comes and the healing takes place. But when it does not, we learn of our true nature. Learning maturity in the gospel, trust in the Lord, and understanding of his methods of salvation and exaltation are key elements of exaltation. So there you have it. I certainly could have expounded several missionary experiences, but my experiences as missionaries were not unlike others, except some added difficulties of a mental illness. But I do hope that you have taken something to help you. It has taken me many years to understand the purposes of the Lord and find greater faith and trust and why I served with a mental illness. I hope that you find it more quickly than I did. Now, I know that in the past I really haven't given out my contact info so that someone who might be interested in discussing the topic, any one of the ones that I've talked about, may contact me for questions or other things. I have decided that sometimes this can be beneficial. And I really don't mind as long as everybody understands that I may not reply right away. It may take me a couple days. For now, I will leave you my email, as I think that's probably the best method. Now, my email is dtsoka@gmail.com. So that is D as in door, T as in train, S as in Sam, O as in Oscar, C as in catch, H as in Henry, and A as in Apple @gmail.com. As always, remember that the Lord requires the fight, and then He can provide the rest. Until next time, when we will talk about healing and what it means to be healed. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.